Question number 9. Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Simple question. Does the Prime Minister stand by his commitments to the Pike River families?
Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, yes.
Supplementary, Mr
Supplementary
Speaker.
Question, Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Does the Prime Minister still believe recovery of the bodies of the 29 miners to be, quote, an absolute priority, unquote, and will he accept the advice of the 2 mining experts, Bob Stevenson, former UK Chiefs Mine Inspector, and Dave Creedy, that recovery of the drift can be done safely?
Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, the Government made available funding to Solid Energy, who have primary responsibility in this matter, for that very purpose. As to the opinion that the Prime Minister might have about the expertise offered by the 2 gentlemen mentioned, there is no basis for him to make any comment on that.
Supplementary, Mr
Supplementary
Speaker.
Question, Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Will the Prime Minister and the Minister of State-owned enterprises ensure Solid Energy makes the decision on whether to re-enter Pike River based on all the available evidence and information, and will he show the families dignity and provide them with the opportunity to seek clarity on any issues raised in that evidence?
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, the question really asks the Prime Minister to get in the road of a decision that needs to be made by the Solid Energy Board. It would be inappropriate to do that.
Supplementary Question, Honourable Damien O'Connor.
During the more than 12 months of reporting on progress to re-enter the Pike River mine, was the Prime Minister briefed at any stage that any re-entry into the Pike River mine would be illegal because there was no second egress?
Honourable Jerry
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, those reports would have gone to Solid Energy.
Order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order.
Mr Speaker, I asked the question, was the Prime Minister...
Order. I didn't exactly catch the question. I'm going to invite the member to ask the question.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. During the more than 12 months of reporting on progress to re-enter the Pike River mine, was the Prime Minister briefed at any stage that any re-entry into the Pike River mine would be illegal because there is no second egress?
Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, I'm unable to answer that question because I don't have that information available, given that I'm answering on his behalf. But in any event, it would be my understanding that matters that related to re-entry to the mine would have been conveyed to Solid Energy for Solid Energy to make a decision about go or no go. So matters about egress or second egress, etc., are not matters that I'm able to comment on. What I would say, though, is that at the time of the original explosion, and then particularly after the second and third explosions in that mine, there was a lot of suggestions that a second egress would be a good idea.
Order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable Damien.
Thank you. I appreciate the difficulty that the Minister has on behalf of the Prime Minister, but I'm seeking from him a commitment to provide the information as to whether the Prime Minister had been briefed in the last 12 months.
Order. But that's not a point of order. You asked the question. The Minister asking on behalf of the Prime Minister said, I just can't give you that information. So it's not a point of order then to raise and seek a commitment. If he wants to put if he has another supplementary and wants to try and do it that way, it might be possible. But you can't use a point of order for that.
That's right.
Question.
Supplementary, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Does the withholding of information from the Pike River families show the same arrogant disrespect as the Prime Minister's comments about the mother of the young West Coaster killed in a motor accident and other parents of the Pike River miners, which he wrongly dodged responsibility for answering questions about yesterday?
Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order.
Mr Speaker, you have ruled earlier today in a very interesting way because you sort of hinted that something might change, but then said it's very difficult and you'd have to make decisions as you go along. But I don't think, sir, you can actually go past, in that consideration, the requirements of Standing Order 378A, which relates to a minister and therefore clearly to the Prime Minister, which states that the minister can have questions put to them relating to public affairs for which the minister is officially connected, or proceedings in the House or any matter of administration for which the minister is responsible. Mr. Speaker, the question just alleged a whole lot of statements that came from various sources, and the requirement to comment on those does not fit any of the requirements that are here in the question. So what I think we're getting to is we're very quickly going to get to a position where the opposition can ask as many catch-22 questions on made-up stuff that they like, and ministers would be expected to respond.
I'll hear from the Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Appreciating your ruling, Mr. Speaker, that clearly apportioned to the Prime Minister some responsibility, I'm aware, and the Pike River families are aware, of a person appointed by the Prime Minister, which they were grateful for, at least 2 years ago, who was to report and liaise directly between the Prime Minister's office and the families. And those are the questions that I'm asking about, Mr. Speaker, in terms of briefings and responsibility. The Prime Minister has responsibility in this area.
Order. I certainly accept the point that the Honourable Damien O'Connor has just raised. He raised a question where, in my mind, there is no doubt there's a ministerial and prime ministerial responsibility. The way in which the question was raised was certainly not helpful, and I haven't got a good record of some of the language used, but it was relatively emotive. The easiest way forward, I would have thought, is for Mr. Brownlee, but it's for him to decide, is to simply answer the question and dispute the facts as they've been laid out. Mr. Brownlee's now raised a further point of order, which, if I understand it, is trying to suggest there is no ministerial responsibility. Well, then maybe I'll ask the Honourable Jerry Brownlee to explain his point succinctly, because it was difficult for me to comprehend.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for that opportunity. If the Honourable Damien O'Connor had asked the question that he managed to get out in his point of order, that would have been a simple thing. But it was everything else that went with it.
Then I've got a very instant solution to this. I'm going to ask the Honourable Damien O'Connor to ask. This is a very sensitive matter, and I appreciate that. I'm going to ask the Honourable Damien O'Connor to ask the question as factually and without emotion as he can, and let's see if I can assist the Honourable Member get an answer from the Minister answering on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Thank you,
Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Mr. Speaker, does the withholding of information from the Pike River families, including the legal advice provided to Solid Energy that it is claimed prevents them from re-entering the mine, does that display a level of arrogance that the Prime Minister, or reports about the Prime Minister, have been towards family members of the Pike River families?
Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Well, firstly, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, I reject any suggestion that there has been disrespect shown to the families of the Pike River victims. Far from it. As Prime Minister, I've never failed to turn up to speak directly to them on occasions when that's what they wanted to do. Mr. Speaker, as for the suggestion that information is being withheld by the Prime Minister's office from the families, that is not something that I can make a comment on, other than to say that for the last 12 months or more, this is a matter that has been in the hands of Solid Energy and the board of Solid Energy. And if there is any information that they are withholding from the public, then we would expect that it is made available at the time that they make decisions.
Question number 10, Kevin Haig.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is